Hello, everyone, and bienvenidas a todas. My name is Samuel Martinez. I'm director of the Instituto, UConn's Institute of Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies. On behalf of this event's co-sponsors, El Instituto, the Literatures, Cultures, and Languages Department, and the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, we welcome you to this 2021 Luis B. Eyzaguirre lecture. Let me begin by acknowledging that the land on which UConn sits is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, and Nipmuc peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting the land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. A few words first about the Luis B. Eyzaguirre lecture series. The Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, which is now at Instituto, the Institute of Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies, and the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, now the Department of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages at UConn, created the Luis Bernardo Eyzaguirre lecture to honor the memory of Professor Eyzaguirre, who taught Latin American literature here at the University of Connecticut for 32 years. In the brief time between the diagnosis of his terminal illness and his passing, Professor Eyzaguirre gave thought to how he wished to be remembered by the university and the Latin American studies community to which he dedicated his professional life. He was pleased to know that a memorial lecture, a series on Latin American literature and culture, would be established in his name with an initial bequest by his family. The purpose of the lecture is to provide students at UConn and the larger community of scholars an opportunity to experience the excitement and humanism of Latin American and Caribbean letters and culture. Now, in its 21st year, the Eyzaguirre lecture series allows the university community to know the human side of Latinx, Latin American, and Caribbean studies by bringing distinguished literary and cultural figures to UConn to share ideas and discourse. While we regret not being able to gather in person for this lecture, we celebrate the return of the Eyzaguirre lecture after a year's pandemic hiatus. We also eagerly anticipate the added presence of the author whose work is the focus of this year's Eyzaguirre lecture, Eduardo Halfon, who is joining us by Zoom from Berlin, Germany. Eduardo Halfon has generously agreed to extend the exploration of his work into a second day by participating in a roundtable discussion with our Eyzaguirre lecturer, Marilyn Miller, and UConn's own Professor of Judaic Studies, Avi Pat. We warmly invite everyone present for today's lecture to join us for that conversation tomorrow at noon. A link to tomorrow's roundtable event will be provided in the chat with this on this lecture platform. Also, please feel free to submit your questions for our speaker through the chat function. I'll now pass the microphone to Jacqueline Los, my esteemed colleague, professor of Spanish here at UConn, and constant friend of the Instituto, who has the honor of introducing this year's Eyzaguirre lecture.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Thank you to all the hosts of this event, Marilyn and Eduardo. It is an absolute pleasure to see you in these Zoom squares, rectangles, and it is really an honor to welcome Professor Marilyn Miller to the University of Connecticut as our Eyzaguirre lecturer. It's been long, we've been long waiting for this visit. I personally have relied upon Marilyn's scholarship as a reference for my own work as a scholar and professor. Marilyn has earned a reputation on both the national and international fronts as a scholar with a transdisciplinary approach who is as meticulous in her assessments as she is courageous and innovative in her conclusions. She is trained as a comparatist, which I always like to add as a comparatist myself. Dr. Miller possesses an unusual breadth when it comes to talking about culture, history, politics, race relations, international relations, and more recently, Jewish studies in the Americas. She has her finger on the pulse as the author of what, to my knowledge, will be the first monograph, Eduardo, you can say, after the award-winning author, Eduardo Halfon, with whom she'll be in conversation tomorrow at noon. While many scholars wouldn't have dared to take on a topic such as Mestizaje, and that's as ubiquitous, this topic of cultural mixing, Dr. Miller accepted it as a challenge. Her investigation into the distinct manifestations of Mestizaje rendered within Jose Vasconceles's conceptualization of the cosmic race, Caribbean expressions around mulatez and representations of mixed raceness in Northeast Brazil, Argentinian tango, miscegenation in Ecuador, and finally, albeit somewhat perversely, within US commodification, is a resource for scholars and students on the crucial topic within Latin American studies. Despite its conservative associations, Miller convincingly shows us through her in-depth historicization of the term mestizaje that it is productive for reckoning with contemporary analyses of hybridity dealing within the post-colonial world. Her rare ability to assess and compare in this broad framework through an examination of not only literature, but also of what scholar Jorge Coronado calls, quote unquote, a cluster of discourses and social formations, makes Miller's book a tool that that everyone sort of refers to and that I'm always referencing for my students. As her first book suggests, one of the many areas in which Miller is an expert is in race in Latin America, a specialization that she has fostered in over 25 years of research in archives and within the field, in the field. Her 2008 book chapter, The Soul Has No Color, But the Screen Does, Angelitos Negros and the Use of Blackface on the Mexican Silver Screen, accomplishes many tasks at once through its demonstration that the Mexican government's denial of symbolic racist acts in the 21st century can be traced back in time to the use of blackface in the golden age of Mexican cinema. In her examination of why Joselito Rodriguez's 1948 Angelitos Negros remains so popular among Latin American and Latino viewers, Miller also asked questions of relevance to contemporary racial inequalities regarding colorism and the intersectionality of race and gender, and concludes with firm declarations against the pernicious effects of the erasure of the actual contributions of African descendant peoples worldwide. I'm going to skip. Her trajectory is quite long, and what's so amazing is it's so diverse. It's quite something to think that we're talking about the same Marilyn Miller when you look at all of her work. In Enemy Aliens in the Crescent City, Camp Algiers, and New Orleans' role in World War II internment, Miller demonstrates her high ethical standard as a cultural critic by surfacing the intertwined histories of Latin America, Europe, and the local spaces that she herself inhabits within New Orleans. This study is without a precedent for the vivid analogy it draws between current repressive forces and past tactics of casting immigrants to the United States as enemy aliens and interning them alongside Axis nationals deported from Latin American countries. It's during narration of the feelings of what is meant to be, for example, a Jewish refugee beside a German Nazi in a camp in New Orleans, makes this book a crossover success, and I can even see it as a feature film. And finally, it's, again, I'm just amazed. She's worked on tango. She has a book on tango that she has edited in a meticulous way, bringing together a very first-rate group of scholars, leading them to think about this dance form that I believe Marilyn herself has participated in. Her vast editorial and authorial dedication to reaching different readerships in the United States and in the Caribbean and Latin America can be seen through her continual going back and forth between Spanish and English in speech and in her publications. Makes her all one of the most distinguished leaders and scholars of our time. And I am so honored to have you here. I just wish we could also spend some time together. I hope it comes soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I don't know if I can live up to all that, but I'll do my best. Really generous introduction. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to deliver the Eyzaguirre lecture for 2021 at the University of Connecticut. The names of many writers and colleagues I admire very much have been Eyzaguirre lecturers of years past, and I feel very fortunate to be in their company. And I'd like to thank my colleagues in Literatures, Cultures, and Languages and El Instituto who plan this lecture each year, especially Professor Jackie Loss in Spanish, my dear friend, and Professor Samuel Martinez, the director of El Instituto. And as Sam mentioned, this talk was delayed twice by COVID, but the silver lining has been that with the help of Avi Pat, the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies, and the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at UConn, we were able to reimagine this as a 2-day mini symposium devoted to Eduardo Halfon with the author present, albeit virtually. So besides this talk today, we will meet again tomorrow on Zoom to talk to Eduardo Halfon, and you of course are all cordially invited. I'm gonna share a PowerPoint here. See. Or I'm going to try to. Okay. Are you all seeing that? Is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I admit to not knowing very much about Luis B. Eyzaguirre or his legacy of more than 3 decades of teaching at UConn before I received this invitation. I found only one of his books in the Latin American Library at Tulane University, El Héroe en la Novela Hispanoamericana del Siglo XX, The Hero in the Latin American Novel of the 20th Century, published in 1973. And I toyed briefly with the idea of situating my talk in relation to Eyzaguirre's study of the hero in the Latin American novel, asking myself how and where Eduardo Halfon and his corpus might fit into such an analysis. Is Halfon himself a hero? Are his characters heroes? Halfon is the celebrated author of some 15 novels. I'm not quite sure about the exact number now because he keeps publishing new things, and the recipient of a laundry list of awards, including the Guatemalan National Prize in Literature in 2018. And in 2019, he received the Edward Louis Wallant Award here in Connecticut in a ceremony moderated by Avi Pat himself. But on the question of whether Halfon is a hero or not, I noticed something very curious, and that is that while his most successful, most beloved works feature an undeniably autobiographical narrator protagonist, one who is also named Eduardo Halfon, and one who shares many of his creator's quirks and qualities, this narrator protagonist does not, at least for me, emerge as a hero. He's too ambivalent, he's too indecisive about what things mean. He says perhaps too much to be heroic in any traditional way. In short, he's more Zelig than hero. It seems best then to look for any heroes within Halfon's cast of characters, as Eyzaguirre did with the authors he studied, such as Cuba's Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Mexico's Carlos Fuentes, and Colombia's Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Halfon's fictions introduce us, though, to several undeniably heroic figures, like the Polish grandfather who survives a succession of concentration camps before migrating to Guatemala, or the Polish boxer, the namesake of Halfon's most celebrated book, who tells the grandfather what to say to avoid the gas chamber or the shot to the back of the neck at Auschwitz. There are other characters whose heroism is perhaps more quiet. In the story Distant, we meet Juan Calel, a university student who, from an indigenous community outside the capital, whose very presence in the classroom seems heroic, given the trauma he and his family and many other families like them have witnessed as part of the Guatemalan Civil War, this very same conflict that would convince Halfon's own family to flee to the United States in 1981. The narrator that stands in for Halfon, the author, on the other hand, often appears as irascible, politically incorrect, a provocateur, even an anti-hero. Heroic or not, as far as I know, this is the first time that the person delivering the Eyzaguirre lecture has taken as her subject a Guatemalan author or a Jewish author or the combination of the two. So to help us in grappling with this unusual topic, I propose we consider three metaphors or concepts that will help guide us: masks, first masks, thresholds, and itineraries. And in most of the talk, I'll be looking at masks and things that function like masks. Towards the very end of the talk, I will discuss briefly first thresholds and then itineraries. So first, masks. No doubt I'm attracted to the idea of masks in Halfon's works as someone who has lived in New Orleans for 20 years. In New Orleans, masks and masking express the very soul of the city, its unique role as the cauldron where a deep and redolent cultural melange continues to bubble up, however beset by the ravages of time, climactic events, racial trauma, and other woes. As these images on this slide of the Mardi Gras Indians or of Louis Armstrong as the king of the Zulus attest, masking in New Orleans signifies power, status, communal bonds, and especially creative prowess. In Halfon's fictions, it seems to me masks function differently, signifying the search for a place of belonging or for survival itself. Here we find less of the ritual and affirmation of identity we see in New Orleans masking, and more of an individual quest to determine one's identity by trying on several possible disguises or forms of camouflage. And very often it's hard to know whether this search is the author's own quest or that of his protagonist. So for the purposes of this talk, I will use Halfon to refer to the author and Eduardo to refer to the textual character or maybe characters who bear his name and likeness. So I start with an anecdote from Halfon's most recent novel, Cancion, published a few months ago, 2021, when the organizers of a gathering of Lebanese authors asked Eduardo, and which is it, author or character? You with me? So Eduardo is the character. So when the organizers of a gathering of Lebanese authors ask Eduardo to participate in their event, he pauses. Is he a Lebanese writer? The narrator admits he read and reread the invitation, wondering if it was a mistake or a joke. But this narrator, a character who, I reiterate, is very much like Halfon himself, ultimately decides that having a grandfather who was born in Beirut is enough reason to accept the invitation. And besides, the event is to take place not in Beirut, but in Japan, a tempting destination. As Halfon the author, as Halfon himself explained, I accepted. I said, why not? I can play the part. I can take that costume out from the closet and pretend to be Lebanese for a few days, if that means going to Japan. Eduardo later explains to his Japanese audience that he is in fact the grandson of a Lebanese grandfather who was not stricto sensu Lebanese, given that said grandfather, also named Eduardo Halfon, had left Beirut before 1920, when it officially became part of Lebanon. The younger Halfon, the Guatemalan-born Halfon, joining us today, was in fact surprised to learn this while researching his grandfather's life, as in his recollection, his grandfather had always described himself as Libanese, and thus for him always was Lebanese. As we can see, the actions of both grandfather and grandson, whether in the flesh or in the text, appear to confirm Halfon's contention that, quote, our identity is nothing more than a collection of masks. One reviewer has written of Cancion, the disguise appears from the very first phrase of the book, but it's a disguise that later one embodies. One becomes the character. It's a disguise linked to identity or identity through a disguise. As this anecdotal appropriation of Lebanese identity suggests, the question of who is Eduardo Halfon has a lot of potentially correct answers. It's a question we can't answer in conventional ways, though. The author's family history weaves together disparate origins, migrations, and languages, symbolized by his four grandparents from the already mentioned Beirut, as well as Aleppo, Alexandria, and Lodz, Poland, as well as a generation of great-grandparents before them, from the Ukraine, Egypt, Palestine, and Spain. These 4 grandparents with their different backgrounds are bound by the destiny or accident that brought them all to Guatemala, all as Jews in a deeply Catholic country. In Guatemala, they decide what to hold on to, like Jewish religious practice or the recipes for kibbeh and mujadarra. They teach their Guatemalan cooks how to prepare, and they decide what to discard or reject. Halfon's Polish grandfather, for example, refused until his death to speak his own mother tongue, associating it with the betrayals of the Holocaust. As a 2nd generation Guatemalan and a 3rd generation Holocaust survivor, Halfon and his favorite narrator, Eduardo, observe and accommodate themselves to the needs of the moment and the setting, rejecting any predetermined role or script. He says, I adapt easily, but it's a superficial adaptation. It's not deep. I'm not deeply anything. You know how I've constructed my identity? By destroying it. Who is Eduardo Halfon then depends on who you ask, when you ask, and maybe even where you ask, as Eduardo suggests in Canción. I'd never been in Japan before, and I'd never been asked to be a Lebanese writer. Jewish writer, yes. Guatemalan writer, clearly. Latin American writer, of course. Central American writer, less all the time. US writer, more all the time. Spanish writer, when it has been preferable to travel with that passport. Polish writer on one occasion in a bookstore in Barcelona that insists on placing my books on the Polish literature shelf. I actually think I've been in that bookstore, by the way. French writer, since I lived for a while in Paris, and some have supposed I'm still there, I always keep all these disguises close at hand, well ironed and hung in the closet. This impulse to treat selfhood as something one tries on, as a disguise or a mask, rather than part of one's skin or sinew, opens up Halfon's writing to a prolonged journey of self-discovery in which the reader is invited to tag along. Or as Juan Camilo Rincon put it, the reader receives a clue, like on a map, to finding a great jewel, which is the cosmogony of the author. That is his view of the universe. We readers who join him on this journey soon discover that a false identity might well supersede a true one, that a mask might come to displace and ultimately replace the countenance it covers. Consider, for example, Peter, a Polish Jew from Galicia who appears in Halfon's 2014 text, Monastery. Peter was in fact not always Peter, but Joseph, who spent the war years living among the Nazis under the assumed identity of a lumberjack named Peter Zanowski. And, quote, masked, camouflaged, lying, he managed to save his life. In Guatemala, until the day he died, even on his tombstone, he always called himself Peter. Subterfuge and refuge are connected in these gestures. As Halfon told one interviewer, we all eventually become the masks that we wear. In Halfon's universe, connections to place are sometimes strong, sometimes fleeting, but always tinged with ambivalence. In 2020, Gabriele Stoppelman called attention to the nomadism that characterizes his fictions, to which he replied, yes, that has a lot to do with my own wandering. I come from a nomadic family. But simply adopting the cliche of the wandering Jew won't solve this puzzle of identity, as not all experiences of Jewishness or wandering can be considered equal. I was born in a Jewish family in Guatemala, he says, which is very different from being born in a Jewish family in Argentina. The cliches attached to the task of the Latin American writer also make Halfon bristle, as we see in this response. I think most Americans still expect the same folklore from Latin American fiction, whether that folklore is magic realism or political dictatorships or the oppression of the indigenous peoples or extreme poverty or drug and border violence, not Jewish protagonists. Jews belong in Eastern European literature, not in Latin American. Personally, though, I'm not interested in any pre-established folklore. I'm only interested in peeking where I'm not supposed to, in sticking my finger in the deepest wound, in throwing myself off the highest cliff. As a professor of Latin American literatures and cultures, I can nod in agreement with Halfon at how we must challenge the stereotypes of Latin America, its writers, and their subject matter. Perhaps such pigeonholing represents the dangers of the single story that Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie warns us of. In her 2009 TED Talk, she talks about how she herself has been subjected to the single story of who is an authentic African or what an African writer can write about. I recommend watching all 11 minutes of this talk, but I think we have time to look at just a little clip here in which she herself admits to falling into the trap of the single story regarding Latin America. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if we can.
I'm just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali.
Thanks, Avi. Wonderful, incredible talk. I really highly recommend it to everyone. Let me go back to sharing my screen. With Adichie's words in mind, I welcome Halfon's pushback from the single story of what Latin America is, who are its peoples, or even what it means to write as a Latin Americanist. At the same time, though, I can't help but shudder at the thought that magical realism, political dictatorships, oppression of indigenous peoples, extreme poverty, and drug and border violence are all being equated to folklore, or even that folklore itself is being maligned. All of these are for me vital, necessary, even inexhaustible topics that we all inside or outside of Latin America need to understand more fully and deeply. After all, dictatorship, oppression of indigenous peoples, drug and border violence, and poverty still represent many of Latin America's deepest wounds, the same ones Halfon wants to stick his finger in. Still, I can give Halfon the benefit of the doubt and assume that what he rejects here is the predictability of such topics, the requirement of defaulting to such topics, the straitjackets they represent. Even Halfon's anxiety-producing name, foreign sounding in both Spanish and English, do we pronounce the H in Halfon or don't we? Exemplifies the slipperiness and malleability of the legacy the author has inherited, but treats as negotiable. According to his paternal grandfather, the surname Halfon comes from an old Hebrew word, or perhaps an old Persian word that means he who changes his life. Those of you familiar with his works know that we find in several of them, something of a running joke regarding the many occasions in which his name is misheard, mispronounced, misspelled, mangled, or discarded outright. Most notably in his 2015 volume, Señor Hoffman, where the title itself alludes to the joke. Time and again, the author protagonist gamely chooses to accept and even integrate these mutilated forms of his name, finding eerie points of connection with other Hoffmans, such as the actor Philip Seymour Hoffman or the author E.T.A. Hoffman, who wrote The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, on which Tchaikovsky based his ballet. It seems that for Halfon, even a name can be a mask. Who's Eduardo Halfon? Who is Eduardo Halfon is not an easy question to answer in linguistic terms either. Maybe it's a stretch, but I'm going to ask you to consider language in relation to masks and masking as well. In a roundtable with two fellow authors, Halfon had this to say about linguistic identity. I was born in Spanish and lived in it for my first 10 years. My second decade, equally, if not more formative, was then spent almost entirely in English. I remember it like suddenly getting a second mother, or perhaps a stepmother, who deeply wanted to eradicate the first. And I've been living with and trying to appease these two ladies ever since. And now, Halfon publishes almost exclusively in Spanish, usually letting others translate his works back into English, a language which he himself is nevertheless perfectly fluent. In fact, he had to relearn Spanish, don it anew when he returned to his home country after living in the United States for many years. And it appears that you can return to your mother tongue after a long hiatus, but as he says, one thing is stubbornly true, and it's this: every sentence that I write, every verb or adjective that I painstakingly insert or remove, every literary thought that I have while writing, always, and I mean always, as my readers are then quick to remind me, begins and ends in English. This linguistic shape-shifting raises questions for Halfon himself, questions which he ultimately answers in this same conversation with yet another metaphor. With all its treacheries, with all its hardships and apparent contradictions, my mind immediately flashes back to my two sparring mothers. Writing in two languages or writing from two languages is also like having two distinct treasure chests from which to grab gold and silver and diamonds. If at mid-sentence, for example, I reach for one chest and can't find there anything I like or anything that fits, I simply reach for the other one. And for some reason, the constant searching and the relentless tugging of these two languages seem to produce, through that same grammatical and syntactical tugging, a new language, a sort of hybrid or blended language, a self-language, really. This notion of self-language, a language uniquely his, begs the parallel question to who's Eduardo Halfon of who's Eduardo Halfon, as in, to whom does he belong? In what group can he claim membership? Is Eduardo Halfon a Latin American, Spanish, Jewish, and even Lebanese writer? Can he belong simultaneously to all these groups? And if we place him in these categories, how does it serve us? Can we or should we even compare his voice to others' voices in these groups, given his idea of a self-language? This, my fellow fans of Halfon, brings me to the particularly prickly question of Latino identity. It would seem that Halfon's status as a Latin American author is quite secure. He was, after all, born in Guatemala, spent the first 10 years of his life there, and then returned after college when it came time to define himself professionally, publishing his earliest works in Spanish from Latin America. His Latino identity, on the other hand, is a little trickier. On the side of, yes, of course he's a Latino author, we have his journey from Central America with his family in 1981, their new life in Florida, the US schools he attended from elementary to university level, and the negotiation of linguistic and cultural alienation in this new host country. Don't all these biographical details squarely situate Halfon in the US Latino experience? Or as one article put it, Guatemalan by birth, but North American by upbringing? There's also the fact that he won the 2019 International Latino Book Award for Mourning, the English language translation of his book Duelo, first published in 2017. I will point out, though, that this same book won the Premio de las Librerías de Navarra Prize in Spain, the Prix du Meilleur Livre Étranger in France, and the Edward Louis Wallant Award in Connecticut, which we have already mentioned and to which we will return. In other words, Halfon is claimed by the Spanish, the French, and the Jews for the same book that won the Latino Book Award. In Dicho hacia el Sur, spoken toward the South, published in a volume with the tantalizing title Sam Noes Meteo, Sam is not my uncle, Halfon has evocatively addressed the confrontation of Latin American and US realities that he experienced, returning once more to the scene of the sparring mothers. And so, just like that, before really understanding what was going on, already immersed in a new language which wasn't entirely foreign to me, but which I didn't entirely possess, I found myself seated at a desk in a perfect classroom, solemn and artificially cooled. From that day forward, I would belong simultaneously to two worlds, two countries, two cultures, but above all, two languages. My mother tongue would gradually give way to this barbaric intruder language, this new stepmother tongue. I would learn in the years ahead to love and hate them both. And I note here that I say my translation because many of these texts are actually written originally in Spanish, including this one. Dicho hacia el sur once again stages the linguistic border crossing of migration to the US as a dramatic face-off between mother tongue and her stepmother replacement. But don't overlook the fact that the text in which Halfon most directly references his US immigrant experience, his assimilation into English, and his ostensible Latino bona fides appears in a collection in Spanish that rejects in its very name a filial or familial relationship with the North and its standard bearer of manifest destiny, Uncle Sam. Latino literature, on the other hand, is a label generally attached to works written and published in English by authors who set out to represent their US Latino communities. Halfon's characters never seem to represent any such community in or out of the US. Even after returning to his home country after finishing college in the States, he found that he didn't really feel at home in Guatemala either. And he since has taken up residence in points as distant and disparate as Nebraska, New York City, La Rioja, Spain, Paris, a village in the south of France, and most recently Berlin, where he is a fellow this year at the Wissenschaftskolleg. It would seem that the Latino label alone doesn't fully capture his cohort of international characters or his protagonist's propensity for navigating the geographies of Guatemala, Belize, Florida, Poland, Serbia, Italy, Portugal, and Japan as they interact with a hodgepodge crew of family members, boyhood companions, gypsies, Holocaust survivors, musicians, drawing teachers, book collectors, and the employees of former concentration camps. In fact, in the story Mourning, the narrator expresses doubt as to whether this assimilation into English is actually complete, or if like the Puerto Rican poet Tato Laviera, he has just become asimilado. Here, Eduardo uses yet another metaphor that ties in nicely with our exploration of masks, disguises, and wardrobe choices. I don't know at what point English replaced Spanish. I don't know if it truly replaced it, or instead I started to wear English like some sort of gear that allowed me to enter and move freely in my new world. I was just 10 years old, but I may have already understood that a language is also a diving helmet. Once again, we are faced with a mask, a disguise, a piece of gear with which one navigates a new or perilous environment. The old diving masks were heavy, clunky, and claustrophobic. Do they suggest to you, as they do to me, a muzzle as much as a means of survival? So, Latin American author? Yes, but don't put him in a box, especially not the magical realism box. Latino author? Maybe, though he doesn't exactly fit the mold. Perhaps we can agree on Halfon's status as a Jewish writer. Dan Ryder described him in a 2019 review as, quote, born, brised, bar mitzvahed, a descendant of Holocaust survivors, and inescapably a Jewish author. For anyone who doesn't know the term brised, it means circumcised, the quintessential mark of Jewishness on the body. As noted, Halfon even won the Wallant Award that honors an under-recognized Jewish writer whose published fiction has made a significant contribution to American Jewry. The announcement, in fact, described him as a Latino Jewish author. Are Halfon and his writing then good for the Jews, expanding the notion for readers in the United States and around the world of the infinite possibilities and forms of Jewish being in the world? As someone who works at the intersection of Latin American and Jewish studies, I'm fascinated with his on-again, off-again relationship with Jewishness. Several scenes in Monastery, 2014, stage this refusal to commit. In a Scottish bar in Guatemala, the narrator explains to two Israeli girls, I'm not Jewish anymore, I retired. In the opening story in the volume, a Jerusalem taxi driver asks Eduardo if he is Jewish, and he responds, sometimes. Unable to consolidate his Arabic-speaking Jewish ancestors with the driver's rigid distinction between Arab and Jew. When his sister, who has moved to Israel and joined an ultra-conservative sect, accuses him of no longer being a Jew as he doesn't keep kosher or follow other ritual mandates, the protagonist agrees completely with her. When his brother reminds him that whether he likes it or not, he is in fact just as Jewish as those in his sister's Orthodox community, Eduardo reacts vehemently, comparing this genetic definition of Jewish identity to Hitler's insertion of Jews in a racial discourse. As you might imagine, these reactions offend the sensibilities of fellow characters in his fictions, as well as a few readers and critics along the way. What do you think? Is it appropriate for a Jew to claim, as in the citation I mentioned earlier, that he's not deeply anything? Can he in fact construct his identity by destroying it? Is Jewish identity finally a mask one can put on or leave hanging in the closet? These questions inevitably make me think of 1492, when not only did Columbus sail the ocean blue, but Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews, and soon after the Muslims too, as the rhyme goes. From that point forward, and even well before 1492, of course, surviving or defining one's Jewishness, whether through conversion, flight, the hidden rituals of crypto-Jewish practice, or even complete rejection of any religious belief or cultural affiliation, has taken innumerable forms. In fact, the incessant questioning of what this fate means, of whether to wear one's Jewishness or hide it, might itself be seen as a very Jewish quality or response. So even if Halfon, or Eduardo, his protagonist, is only a Jew sometimes, or has retired from being a Jew, even if these apparent snubs of Jews or Judaism rub some readers the wrong way, they are, for me, good for the Jews and good in general. Why? Because they deter us from the dangers of the single story of what it means to be authentically Guatemalan or Latino or even Jewish. Of course, Halfon's inclusion in the category of Jewish writers has to do not only with questions of bloodlines and family legacy, but also with the fact that a significant part of his work, including the celebrated collection, the PolishBoxer, has sometimes been described as Holocaust fiction. There are references to the Shoah in many of his works, so much so that Erica Dreyfuss suggests that, quote, even in stories that ostensibly focus elsewhere, the grandfather and his Holocaust history hover. A 2019 article in the Times of Israel titled, "Why is Holocaust Fiction Still So Popular?" mentions Halfon, suggesting 4 key reasons for the continuing popularity of the Holocaust trope in works like his. A mix of who is telling the story, the 3rd and 4th generations, the types of stories, not straightforward but morally ambiguous, the historical truth at the heart of all these novels, and our current political moment. All these reasons are relevant to Halfon's work, even if not a single one of his volumes is devoted entirely to the topic of the Holocaust. As with the other classifications we've considered, we need an expansive notion of Holocaust fiction if we are to categorize Halfon's works in this way. When asked in 2018 if his work could be classified as literature of the Lager, literature dealing with concentration camps, the author responded, "In my work, the Lager never arrives, although it's always there circling like some kind of ghost. I'm writing about the Nazi concentration camps because of my Polish grandfather. That's my heritage, my obligation." Thus, while Halfon and his literary doppelgangers adamantly reject being pigeonholed and adamantly insist on leaving open the question of who's Eduardo Halfon or to whom his works and achievements belong, Jewish memory stands out as a central axis and force in his writing. I don't know if I believe in myself, he admits. I would say that I believe more in the books I've written. And so with this statement, I'd like to move on finally from masks and consider the notion of thresholds. In fact, we've already seen how the questions of identity might be viewed as a series of thresholds that Halfon negotiates as he and his protagonists move through their varied journeys and quests. We've seen how language functions as a much traversed threshold for the author as well, a veritable boxing ring for his Spanish mother tongue and her English stepmother usurper. We have alluded to the geographic thresholds between the place of one's birth and the ephemeral refuges that migration or nomadism offer. But there are also other important thresholds to consider. There is the threshold of the empty mass graves that Eduardo visits in Lodz, graves the last residents of the Lodz ghetto dug as their own final resting place, as the Germans liquidated the ghetto, but from which these Jews were ultimately saved when the Germans fled before the Russian advance. A threshold might be less physical, like the place where worldviews brush up against each other in Distant, that story in which the indigenous student Juan Calel explains to his literature professor that in Cachiquel, the word for poem means braid of words. And in one of his earliest works, De Cabo Roto, Halfon wrote in the prologue, quería narrar en el lindero mismo que divide la historia y la ficción. This impulse to narrate from the threshold of history and fiction serves us as a through line for understanding Halfon's entire body of work. Though he builds his text with elements of personal, family, national, and cultural history, he vociferously maintains that all his work should ultimately be defined as fiction. He says, I believe the key there is that they are not memoirs. I don't write memoirs. It's not autobiography. It's fiction. Everything I write is fiction. This question has been a bone of contention for his critics, many of whom have associated Halfon with the genre of autofiction, a term he has dismissed. Autofictions are not, for me, the idea of a threshold or contact zone, at least between literature and history, remains crucial for understanding his work. When Desmond Barry asked him why, if his stories are fiction, his protagonist is almost always named Eduardo Halfon, the author explained, perhaps because I want readers to have a visceral experience. I want them to believe what is going on in the story, that all this really happened. So if the author, Eduardo Halfon, has the same name as the narrator in the story, then the reader is lulled into thinking that the events in the story are probably real. In writing them, they all start off as real in some way, and then they go somewhere else, somewhere less real, but just as true, or perhaps even more so. Which leads us finally to itineraries, and especially to the itineraries of memory, with which I will finally close. In the titular story of Halfon's 2014 collection, Monastery, the protagonist's grandfather presents him with a scrap of yellowed paper. On it is inscribed the address of the apartment in Lodz, where the grandfather was living when he was captured by the Gestapo at 16, setting in motion his long journey through several concentration camps and on to Guatemala. The narrator receives this paper from his grandfather's hands as, quote, a mandate, an order, a dictate, an itinerary, a travel guide, a few coordinates on the mysterious and uneven map of our family. It was, in short, a prayer, his last prayer. This textual testament propels the protagonist forward to investigate his grandfather's history as a precious inheritance, a sacred itinerary. But many of the itineraries in Halfon's works are not so apparent or transparent. Sometimes a family obligation or chance itself determines an itinerary. In the volume The PolishBoxer, a connection around jazz prompts the central character to travel to Belgrade in search of a gypsy musician he had heard play Beethoven and Rachmaninoff in Guatemala. In the story Tel Aviv Was an Inferno, blood ties obliged the narrator to travel to Israel and to attend his sister's wedding. But even before he's out of the airport, he has a chance encounter with Tamarda, one of the Israeli women he'd met years earlier in the Scottish bar in Guatemala. Later, they will sunbathe by the Dead Sea and discuss the tricks of survival, of finding one's way by changing names, languages, religious beliefs, and even one's gender, by dressing or undressing for the occasion, by hiding in a monastery, by passing as the other, even when such actions might be read as falsehoods or betrayals. Moving from one geography to another, between and amidst languages, through the world of other texts, and especially through the fertile realms of memory, arguably constitutes the principal action in Halfon's work. He himself has followed an itinerary of invitations to book fairs, fellowships, speaking engagements, and even an Italian concentration camp. itineraries that reappear in his writings and compel him to rethink who he is. Halfon seems to be on a perpetual quest, an ever expanding itinerary in which accepting any fixed or predetermined identity would mean the end of the exploration that infuses his writing with breath, with inspiración. The twin tasks of accessing memory and writing fiction should be seen then not as contradictory, but as complementary exercises, both involving the activation of the imagination. And if, as Jonathan Sarna contends, cultural forgetfulness is a tool of ideological consolidation, then this kind of remembering is an exercise of both personal and communal liberation. In Halfon's universe of fictional truth, it might be amusing or bemusing, but not illogical, that a trip to Japan where he passes as a Lebanese writer would plant the seed for Canción, his latest work of fiction, about the kidnapping of his Syrian-born grandfather in Guatemala in 1967. Who knows where his next disguise will take him or us? He assures us that clearly this itinerant life is continuing. It's a nomadic existence, a Jewish type of life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for this incredibly thoughtful discussion opening to our mini symposium. I wanted to remind everyone that they can feel free to put their questions in the chat, or also raise your hand, and we will have a Q&A. We'll begin the Q&A. I do not see a question yet. I know, Sam, you're here and you're helping to moderate too, so please jump in. There you are. Sam? Yes. Stephanie Pigeon has raised her hand. And I think that Avi, you're also helping moderate here with the technological part, right?
There we go.
There we go. Great.
Thank
Stephanie?
you. Thank you so much for this, to the organizers and to Marilyn for this really wonderful presentation. I was wondering a little bit about how you might see Halfon's writing in relationship to other Guatemalan Jewish authors. I'm thinking of like people like Victor Pereira or Francisco Goldman, who are also in these overlapping and kind of sometimes diverging categories. And yet there's this phenomenon, there's clearly, you know, something that's happening within literary criticism that is interpreting Halfon's work as something that's very different from that. And it's something that, and it's a question that I've been grappling with a lot. So I'm just wondering if you have any, you know, because as you've mentioned, and as I agree with, there seem to be a lot of things about his oeuvre that are sort of sui generis. And I'm just wondering if you've thought a little bit about how how his works, and it feels very strange to be talking about you in the third person, Eduardo, with you here on the screen, looking at your face and saying him, and it feels very strange.
It's strange for me too, Stephanie.
and I mean, I know that this is for tomorrow, but if you have any thoughts on the matter, I would love to hear that also. And thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Eduardo, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, it's bizarre that such a specific type of writer. Now, a Jewish Guatemalan. There's actually four of us, Stephanie. There's David Unger as well, who's a cousin, by the way, who's a distant cousin. But it's very different. All of us are very different. The one I've read the least is Victor Pereira. I've read him, but less than Goldman and David Unger, and we seem to be in different paths. So I don't disagree with the critics of that you mentioned, Stephanie, of saying that we're all headed almost in different directions. Francisco has been more engaged, so to speak, with Guatemalan recent history, with the Civil War. Victor Pereira was, from what I understand, more of an essayist and working from an essay point of view. Would you agree, Marilyn?
I think so. I think that there's a insider-outsider tension that applies here as well. You know, that although these 4 authors are ostensibly Jewish Guatemalan authors, they fall on that insider-outsider line in different places. And I use a story by Pereira often in my teaching called Kindergarten, and it's about you know, being outside, being rejected, being a child in an elementary school setting where the person closest to him is another other in the Guatemalan context. And so I think there are some places where there's joint otherness or shared otherness, but that's perhaps the thing you most share. So
yeah, I agree. It's a different type of otherness now. David Unger grew up in the States. I think he left when he was 4. He stopped speaking, by the way. His reaction to English was to stop speaking for months. It took him a long time to come to terms with that. Francisco Goldman grew up in Boston. So the otherness that I felt growing up in Guatemala, those first 10 years, is intimately related with Judaism and the lack of Judaism in the country. So growing up in a sort of strange and alien surrounding, you know, where all your friends are doing one thing and you're doing another, and you're forbidden doing those other things. So my outsiderness is I think stems from that, stems from those years.
And I just want to say, Stephanie has a wonderful article on Halfon and the question of indigeneity. So she's herself an expert on these issues, and everyone should read her fine essay.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe that Florinda Goldberg has a question. Avi, would you be able to?
Yeah, it was a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it very much. And just to the list of writers that you mentioned, I want to add another name, Aurora Levins Morales, which is very important and also puts a feminine touch in this list. And she has also, of course, every one of them is different, but she also has her own line of leading and dealing with her hybridity. I just wanted her name to be mentioned too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Marco Romero Velasquez.
Thanks, Jackie. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Marilyn, thank you so much for those comments. And Eduardo, it's a real honor to be here in this space with you. As a Mexicano-Americano who was born in Chicago, grew up in Canada, and married into a large New York Jewish family, I feel these transitory spaces that you navigate. And I wonder about the kind of the framing of not only your identity, but your work, and of course to Marilyn as well, outside of the nation state, right? Thinking instead of positioning as Guatemalan or American and using languages as proxy for those national spaces, thinking more aligning with stateless peoples, the Roma, Zapatistas, Quebecois, Basque, and other orientations, and thinking about those literatures and identities, the kind of fronterizo spaces, right? It's thinking from the borders and the borderlands instead from national orientations. I find myself more comfortable in those spaces because they're spaces of seeming ephemera and transition, but really they have their own traditions, languages, and cultures that for me help me understand reading Eduardo Halfon and in tandem with those other kinds of people and cultures. An observation and a question.
Marilyn?
I'm really interested in this idea too. I think you could even apply it to, obviously, that is the situation. Statelessness is the situation of most Holocaust survivors. Even at the moment when they become victims of the Nazi apparatus, they're rendered stateless. So that's a really good thing to think about in terms of not just Halfon as an author, but also his characters and the subjects that he chooses to talk about. So thank you. And also it made me think of Milan Rakic, right?
Rakic, yeah.
That is, Serbian and a gypsy and both together, and is, constantly in movement, both in the story about, in Epistrophe, the story in which he's playing in a concert in Guatemala, but also in the postcards that he sends, in this correspondence that develops between the narrator and this character. So
yeah, I was thinking along those lines as well, Marilyn, and I'd never thought about this in terms of statelessness, which is really interesting. My words tend to be more, nomadic people or diaspora, different types of diasporic rootlessness, and I think of my two grandfathers, who arrived in Guatemala and who adopted Guatemala as their state, nation state, but not really. Not really. They were there almost as guests, never really involved, never really there. So stateless also, although they lived there and died there. But my attraction is to this type of movement, this type of migration that doesn't end, that seems to hover. It's really interesting. Your point is really interesting.
I am not seeing any more hands up. Sam, have you spotted a hand?
No, I haven't, but I'd just say personally that there's so much that I can identify with in this fiction. And it's in the hybridity and the multiplicity of identities, the traveling nature of being human, and a process of always becoming. And I would just be curious to hear what you would have to say, Marilyn, about your own family history and life experiences that draws you with the intensity that's necessary to read and reread, imbibe, dwell with this literature. The thought must have occurred to you that maybe it wasn't an accident that you picked up Eduardo Halfon as a particular focus of study.
Yeah, it was only accidental in the sense that I, for at least 15 years as an academic, I focused entirely on Latin American studies without thinking about Jewish studies or making that a focus of my research. I sort of had the sense that as a Latin Americanist, there wasn't room for that. And I know that the field is changing, both the field of Jewish studies and the field of Latin American studies. They're both changing to be more inclusive of this. We have LAHSA, we have Latin American Jewish Studies Association now. But when I began as an academic, there didn't seem to be a space for that. And it seemed like you either had to do one or the other. And so it was liberating for me to find this way to continue as a Latin Americanist, but consider issues of Jewish studies and Jewish identities as well. I have an immigrant, Russian immigrant Jewish family story on my father's side, and there was always the idea that he could have gone to Ellis Island or he could have gone to Buenos Aires, right? The two, axes of Jewish immigration in that period. And I didn't know my father or my father's family until I met some family members through Ancestry on his side. And this, happened within the last decade. I think some of my cousins are on the call. That as well, having this sort of family connection that was now concrete helped me, so have the confidence or empowered me to pursue this. And it turns out that all of my cousins are very interesting people with very interesting stories. And it was wonderful to sort of pursue the Miller story from that perspective. So undoubtedly, I'm attracted to Halfon's work because he does that kind of work. He's done that kind of work, and I'm grateful for these people, these family members that I met late in life that let me into that part of the family. But I do very much feel that I teach a course now at Tulane called Jewish Latin American Cultural Expression. I alternate teaching it in Jewish and in Spanish and English. So the idea is that we teach Latin American studies without usually incorporating anything Jewish, and we teach Jewish studies without incorporating anything Latin American. And so I am the standard bearer, la antorcha aquí, for thinking those two things together. I'm incredibly grateful and lucky to be in a place like Tulane, where there's a very strong Latin American studies program and also a very strong Jewish studies program, which provides me with resources to do this. So, but it was particularly accidental, I guess, that I was in a bookstore in Barcelona, perhaps the same one where they shelve Halfon's books on the Polish literature shelf. La Central, no sé si sea La Central.
Which one though? There's two of them.
Is it only one of them? Okay.
There's two.
Okay. No, and I just asked the clerk there what he recommended in Jewish authors, and he handed me Biblioteca Bizarra, and that's when I started reading Halfon. I haven't, I've come to this sort of late as well, but now I'm immersed in La Cosa Halfon, so I'm a groupie. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that was the way you got in through Biblioteca Bizarra.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
So
I have questions and comments, but I'm going to save them for tomorrow.
Okay.
Should I?
Sam, was there somebody else who had a question maybe?
Yes, there is. Nurit Pat has brought in a question, and I'll just read it for everyone. Do you think that our identities change as we age and as our view of what's important in life changes? And she's not saying if that's directed toward you, Marilyn, or to Eduardo.
Might be to you, Samuel.
No, not Bob.
Yeah, Sam. Yeah, Sam, your turn.
No. But I forgot to say, instead of, I should say Halfon and not Eduardo, because it's the author.
Right.
Thank you for catching that.
Or so you think.
Or so you think.
Right. That's the mystery.
I can try to answer. The idea of identity, that word, that seems to follow me now everywhere. It took me years to know that that's what I was writing about. It was actually a Guatemalan journalist about 10 years in that said, Eduardo, that what you're really doing is writing about identity. And he was right, of course, he was right. It's just not something that was intentional. It's not something that I knew what was happening. but I agree that I seem to circle this idea of identity, and I think, Nurit, that for me, anyways, I'm just a writer. I'm just, I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I don't know much about the concept of identity, but it seems to me that our identity is a sort of, it's changing and malleable and fluid. I just lived 2 years in France, and that is undoubtedly in there already. The French is beginning to seep in terms of language, in terms of lifestyle. Now I'm in Berlin, and who knows what's going to happen here. So not only age, but experience seems to mold and flex our identity. Our history, our family history, also, but also what we find out about our family history. Marilyn just talked about that. You just recently learned about your father's family, and so that can also alter the way we see ourselves. So I just think this idea of identity is so interesting because it's so ever changing and ductile and so anything but fixed.
Yeah, there's
Anything
a little piece I wanted to bring into the talk, but it was already a little bit long, which was Jackie and I discussed this just briefly in preparation for this. There's a text by Eyzaguirre, maybe you know it some way, called Crónica Habanera. And in the Crónica Habanera, which was published in 1997 in INTI, I think that's a Chilean journal, literary journal. Anyway, he publishes this Crónica Habanera after visiting Havana in 1993 for a conference at the Casa de las Américas. And, he's already studied Guillermo Caballero Infante's Tres Tristes Tigres. He's already has this, idea, this illusion of what Havana is going to be like. He wants to go be a tigre himself. He wants to, enjoy the Havana nightlife and everything. And so he goes and he talks about this experience. And of course, 1993 is the hardest part of the special period, when there's so much lack in Cuba. There's hardly any food and very, very difficult circumstances. And so he's being besieged on all sides during his visit by people, trying to sell him things or trying to sell him company. There's some sort of like pre-Viagra drug that they're selling on the street to help people, be able to take advantage of the offer of the jineteras. There's this kind of desperation all around him in Havana at this moment. So of course the illusion of Caballero Infante's Havana falls away, and he sees how desperate things are. But something else happens that's really wonderful, and he attends this conference at Casa de las Américas, and he's with these wonderful Cuban poets and writers, and he goes to Eliseo Diego's house, and he realizes there's more to this story. There's both more to this story than than Caballero Infante's story, and there's also more to this story than the abjection that he's seeing on the street. And in this Crónica, he mentions our good friend Luisa Campuzano, who's this figure who's been in Casa de las Américas for many years, and they call her Enciclopedia Luisa because she knows everything about Cuban history, Cuban literature. And so I told her I was going to be doing this talk, and I asked her if she had read the Crónica Habanera, and she said, oh yes, I remember him, and I remember that, she gave me the date it was published, and so again, that's a way to tie in the ways in which travel, the ways in which being somewhere else, experiencing somewhere else forms you, changes your identity, makes you makes you malleable to rethinking who you are and improves your plasticity as a person, I would say. Plasticity in a good sense, in a positive sense, as is happening to Eduardo, as has happened for these 2 years in France and is happening now in Berlin. And hopefully it can happen more to all of us as COVID subsides and we can travel more. So.
Thank you for sharing us with that anecdote more fully. Fernando Rosenberg, Professor Fernando Rosenberg, I think has a question as well.
Hi, it's wonderful to see some friendly faces. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I enjoy very much, Marilyn, your presentation on masks and itineraries. And I was wondering, and this is both, of course, to Eduardo and to Marilyn, how do you connect this with language? I understand most of your writing, Eduardo, is in Spanish, except for a few exceptions. And how the language might perform as a mask, I was wondering, and particularly in connection to the experience of exile and the history of the itineraries of the Jewish people, right? Where so many languages were related to identity, so many languages that were lost forever or recover in a new fashion. I'm talking about, I'm thinking of Hebrew, I'm thinking of Judesmo, Ladino, I'm thinking of Arabic, I'm thinking of, and of course Yiddish, but how languages, how this experience of language loss and language reinvented and language forgotten, in the case of your Polish grandfather, language rejected. I mean, can you say something, or Marilyn or Eduardo, more about language and identity and language as a mask? And wondering, Eduardo, your rootness in the Spanish language, it seems like pretty stubborn, considering your constant, changing of passports and nationalities and audiences and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Marilyn, do you want to go, or you want me to
Go for it.
Go for it. Fernando, mucho gusto verte.
Debería decir que es otro Eyzaguirre. That Fernando is somebody who's presented the Eyzaguirre lecture in the past. So
not so long ago.
I'm honored to follow in your footsteps, Fernando.
So I'm going to tie in your question. I see a question in the chat that is related to yours, actually. Somebody, Joanne, I think, wrote, why did you relearn Spanish rather than writing in English? And that's a great question. I think both of these are great questions. Our relationship with language. Roland Barthes wrote or said that a writer is he or she who has a problem with language. And I think I have a problem with language. I think I'm linguistically challenged in a way. So I straddle Spanish and English. I didn't forget Spanish, Fernando, but I forgot how to use it. I think that's a better way of saying this. Now, after 12 years of living in the US, so from 10 to 23, so almost 13 years of refusing to speak Spanish. So our parents would speak to us in Spanish, but we would answer in English. I just forgot how to use it. I went back to Guatemala with a very, very poor Spanish, very heavily accented. I could only speak in usted. I remember that. I couldn't do tu o vos. I was ridiculed and etc. by my friends, and I slowly started to get it back. I had to get it back, but it was more akin to not biking for 12 years and then stepping onto a bike. You kind of have it, but you don't have it fluently. And I was in Guatemala when I discovered literature. I think this is the key to why I started writing, and why I started writing in Spanish. Even though when I did start to write, I was 28 or 29 when I discovered books. I got to books very late. And quite by accident. I fell into literature. I was in Guatemala. So I began in Spanish. That's a very easy answer. I was there, and so I began in Spanish. But I think there's a deeper answer, and it has to do with childhood. And so that rootedness, is that the word you use? That stubborn rootedness, I think has to do with childhood, not mother tongue. So not Spanish as mother tongue, as the first one in, but rather those first 10 years were lived in Spanish. And if you read what I write, those first 10 years are fundamentales. I keep going back there for some reason, to search for clues, to search for answers, to search for the whys of future decisions and future experiences. So Spanish is my literary language because childhood was my language. And the English then becomes a mask. I'm writing more and more in English, by the way, in the last 2 years. It just kind of happened. I thought it was going to happen when I lived in Nebraska again, and it didn't. But when I lived in France, it did. So now here in Germany, I'll start writing in French, maybe. I think that's kind of the way it's been happening. So I've been writing more in English, but maybe, and this maybe Marilyn can you see all of this, Marilyn, from farther away than I do. I'm too involved, but I think the idea of a mask or a disguise or a, what is it called in English? The diving helmet. It's much nicer in Spanish, no? It's escafandra, much nicer. Can also be a way of dealing with this other language, or using this other language as a mask to move in the U.S. Literary world. The texts that I write in English are mostly for the New York Review of Books, or the LA Times, or the Guardian. So I'll put on that mask in order to write those texts, maybe.
And haven't you been doing that more? Like,
More.
you wrote
More.
for the pandemic
Yeah.
journal, you wrote for,
Yeah.
talking about experiences outside
Yeah.
the United States, in other words.
Yes. I've been writing more. The last 2 stories I've written, this is a mess, but I wrote them in English and Spanish at the same time. So I had 2 windows open. The practical explanation, I had two windows open on my screen, and I was working on this story at the same time in English and Spanish, and it was really fascinating. It was complicated because if I changed a comma here, I had to go change it there. But something that I would do in English would affect the Spanish. I would have to work Spanish in order to say that, and vice versa. So I've been writing more and more in both. And then there's another issue with this, Marilyn, which is really interesting. And then I have to translate these pieces, because the pieces that I wrote originally in English now want to be published in Spanish, and vice versa. There's some stories that I have in Spanish that I have to work into English. And I love going into English. It's easy for me. And I abhor, I detest going into Spanish. It is so difficult, so laborious. I don't know why. It should be the other way around, but it's not. I feel more natural going into English. That book that's behind you, that William Carlos Williams book, was very complicated. I translated his doctor stories into Spanish, and it was not easy. He's not easy to begin with, but going to Spanish for me is more complicated for some reason.
I have a comment, I think, unless I don't see another hand up right now. I do have one comment to Eduardo. Eduardo, wasn't that completely like crazy making, having 2 screens? Do you do that on a regular basis, the 2 screens up?
No, I did that with the last 2 stories. I've done that just to see what would happen. And it's a little bit crazy.
Because I feel like that you would want some sort of scan of your brain, what it's doing when you're working on such
I think
very fast.
The hard part, Jackie, was keeping track of the track changes. It was like a track changes in my head.
Wow.
Yeah. That if I changed an adjective here, I have to go change it there.
Because even the punctuation is
Yes, everything.
distinct, you know, so
Everything,
it's that's
everything. But they fed off each other. So there's paragraphs that I wrote in English that I said, oh, this is great. Now I'll write it in Spanish. And the other way around. It was really, really interesting. And the next book that's coming out in English, I don't know if I told you this already, Marilyn, but Canción will be published in English next year. We just signed that contract, and I'll translate parts of that with Danny and Lisa again. But I always work very closely with them. With the 3 previous books and now with this one, we just work on it together because I can and because I have to.
We need to have you come back in addition tomorrow at another point to talk about translation and your work, because we have a whole translation studies, and that would be very interesting program. So I don't see another hand up, and I'm sorry if I'm missing someone, but I know that we're supposed to close now. Sam, do you see anyone? Avi, do you see one? And Marilyn, Eduardo, are there hands up?
But that leaves just more to discuss tomorrow, eh?
Tomorrow, yeah.
And I've been so delighted with the contrapuntal character of this year's Eyzaguirre lecture. It's really like nothing we've ever had before. And the duet, with thanks to Marilyn and to Halfon, will become a quartet tomorrow, I think, with Avi Pat and Jackie Los joining a roundtable discussion where we'll continue these themes and explore so much more. So I hope that you'll all be able to join us. As a reminder, the link for the roundtable discussion tomorrow at noon is in the chat of this meeting. And I think, Avi, can you confirm for me also where folks can register by going to the Center for Judaic Studies website as well?
Yes, there's also, if you go to the Center for Judaic Studies website, and I'll put it in the chat as well, you can go to our event listing page and access the link there as well. So I'll drop that in.
Wonderful. Well, hope to see you tomorrow, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.